He thought fear made him untouchable. He was wrong. Damien Voss built his empire on silence. The silence of enemies buried in concrete. The silence of judges who took his money, and the silence of a pregnant wife who learned that screaming only made it worse. But silence has a breaking point, and the night Damien forgot about the security camera in the East Corridor was the night his entire empire began to die. If you've ever watched someone powerful believe they would never face consequences, stay until the end, because this story is about what happens when the wrong man's daughter stops being afraid. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, and if someone you know needs to hear this, share it before you keep watching. Deuce. Part 1. The storm came in from the east the way bad things always did in this city. Quiet at first, almost polite, and then suddenly everywhere at once. Isabella Moretti Voss stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the East Corridor and watched lightning split the sky over the water. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and still, and she studied it the way you study a stranger. You're not sure you recognize anymore. She was 31 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. She had not spoken to her father in 14 months. She pressed one hand flat against the window. The glass was cold. Outside, the rain hammered the stone terrace and turned the garden into something shapeless and dark, and she thought about how strange it was that a house this large could feel this small. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps. The particular weight of his walk, heavy through the heels, unhurried, like a man who had never been in a situation he couldn't control. Damien Voss moved through doorways the way he moved through everything else, like the space belonged to him because he'd decided it did. He stopped when he saw her standing at the window. He had a glass of bourbon in one hand, and his tie was already loosened, and she could tell from the way he was holding his jaw, just slightly forward, slightly tight, that dinner had not gone the way he'd wanted. She'd learned to read him the way a person reads weather. Not because she wanted to, because she had to. "You're still up," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He looked at her for a moment. The glass in his hand caught the light from the hallway. "Marcos didn't come through with the port permits," he said. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't an apology. It was the setup. She'd learned to recognize setups too. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said. She kept her voice flat. Not warm, which could be mistaken for mockery. Not cold, which could be mistaken for defiance. Just present. Just there. She had spent 4 years calibrating the exact tone of her own voice so that it gave him nothing to grip. "Are you?" He moved toward the bar cart near the window. "Yes." "You don't look sorry." "I'm tired," she said. "It's late." He poured 2 fingers of bourbon over ice and didn't offer her anything, which was fine, which was how she preferred it, because the fewer reasons she had to stand in this room, the better. She put her hand back on the glass. Outside, a branch from the oak tree at the edge of the property bent sideways in the wind, and she watched it and counted her breaths. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand. My back—" "I didn't ask about your back." She sat. She chose the chair nearest the door, not because she thought she could make it to the door if she needed to, but because proximity to exits was a habit she'd developed so gradually she no longer thought of it as a strategy. It was just how she existed in rooms with Damien. He stood at the bar cart with his back to her for a while. She could hear the ice shifting in the glass. Outside, the storm moved closer, and the lightning came in shorter intervals now, and she counted the seconds between flash and thunder the way she'd counted them as a child. Except as a child, she'd been counting because she was curious. Now she counted because it gave her something to do with her mind that wasn't this room. "Peterson called me tonight," Damien said. "During dinner." Peterson was the family attorney. She said nothing. "Apparently someone has been making inquiries. About me. About our finances." She kept her face still. "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that come from someone with military clearance." He turned and looked at her. His eyes were dark and perfectly calm, which was worse than when they weren't calm, because the calm was not peace. The calm was control. "Your father still have those connections?" "I wouldn't know. I haven't spoken to him. That's what you keep telling me." "It's true." He looked at her for a long time, The bourbon glass hung from his fingers. He had hands that looked like a builder's hands, wide across the knuckles, capable, and she had learned not to think about the things those hands had done because thinking about it made her afraid, and being afraid made her react, and reacting gave him information he would use. "I want to believe you," he said. "Then believe me." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make it sound simple." He crossed the room and she held herself very still, and he stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the bourbon and the faint trace of cigar smoke from wherever he'd been before dinner. "If I find out you've been talking to him, if I find out you've said one word to anyone about our home, about our life, you understand what that means." She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "I understand." He watched her face. She gave him nothing to read there. That was the only game she still won. After a moment he moved away back toward the window, and she allowed herself a single controlled breath. He stood with his back to her again, watching the rain, and she thought, as she had thought many times in this house, that from a distance, from the outside, this would look like a marriage. A man standing at a window, a woman sitting in a chair, a storm outside, an ordinary night. The thunder came. She didn't flinch. She had stopped flinching at thunder years ago. You stopped flinching at the things that couldn't hurt you. You saved the stillness for the things that could. Well, she remembered the exact day she stopped believing it would get better. It wasn't the first time he hit her. The first time she'd done what people do. She'd found explanations. The pressure he was under, the deal that had gone wrong, the way she'd pushed back at exactly the wrong moment. She'd turned it into something that made sense because the alternative, that she was living inside something that could not be reasoned with, was too enormous to hold all at once. It wasn't the second time either, or the third. It was a Tuesday in March, 14 months ago, when she'd been sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast, and he'd come in and looked at her across the kitchen island and said, "Good morning," in a voice that was completely ordinary, completely pleasant, and sat down with his coffee and opened his phone. And she had realized that for him, the night before had not happened, not been forgiven, not been filed away, simply not happened. He had not processed it. He had not carried it. He would not think of it again until the next time he needed to use it. That was the morning she understood she was living with something that could not be changed, not reformed, not reasoned with, not reached, just survived or not survived. She called her father 3 days later from a borrowed phone at the home of a woman named Celia, who was the wife of Damien's driver, and who looked at Isabella with a kind of careful recognition that told her Celia already knew. Not everything, but enough. Women in houses like this always knew enough. The call lasted 6 minutes. She didn't tell Marcus everything. She told him some things, and then she heard the quality of silence on his end of the line change, and she knew he'd understood the rest. He said, "Tell me what you need." She said, "Not yet, not yet. He'll know." Her father had never been a man who was comfortable with waiting. He'd spent 30 years in the military commanding other people's patience while spending very little of his own. She heard the cost of it in his voice when he said, "All right." She said, "I'm going to be okay." She had not spoken to him since. The East Corridor camera was Damien's mistake, though he didn't know it yet. The house had 42 cameras. She knew this because in the early years of their marriage, when she was still trying to understand the shape of the life she'd agreed to, she'd asked about the security system. Damien had shown her the control panel with the pride of a man showing off something expensive. He'd pointed out each zone, each coverage area, each blind spot he'd engineered deliberately, places where he met with people he didn't want recorded. He had not thought to show her the cameras he'd forgotten about. The East Corridor was a space between the library and the formal sitting room that had been designed as a transitional space, wide enough for a small settee and 2 chairs with a view of the back garden. It was the kind of room that existed in very large houses. Not a room anyone had a reason to go to, just a space that happened to exist between the rooms that mattered. Damien rarely went there. The camera had been installed during a security upgrade 3 years ago, and then never incorporated into the primary monitoring system, which was managed by a company Damien trusted precisely because their invoices were routed through 3 different shell companies, and their employees knew better than to mention certain things they saw. The East Corridor camera fed into a secondary system, an older model, a backup system from the original construction that recorded automatically to a cloud server and had never been disabled because no one had thought to disable it, and no one had thought to check it because the East Corridor was just a room that happened to exist between rooms. Isabella had discovered it by accident. She'd been in the corridor one afternoon when she heard Damien's voice in the library, raised in a way it wasn't raised in her presence, sharp and unguarded, and she'd stood very still and listened, which was something she'd become very good at. While she stood still, she'd noticed the small indicator light, red, blinking steadily, up in the corner by the crown molding, angled toward the settee area. She'd looked up the model number. It took her 3 days. She had to be careful about what she searched for and when, which meant using the tablet she kept in her private bathroom, where the signal was technically on the house network, but rarely monitored because Damien's IT people focused on the main terminals in his office. She found the model. She found the server address. She found that the footage archived automatically at midnight every night and was stored for 60 days before the oldest files were purged. She created an account. She linked it. And then she waited. The night he came home from the Marcos dinner was a Friday in November. He'd been in a bad mood for 3 days before that. Quiet and contained, which was its own kind of weather system, the pressurized low that always preceded something. She'd tracked it. She'd adjusted. She'd been careful about everything, her tone, her movements. When she spoke, and when she didn't. What she ate, and whether the sound of her silverware against the plate was the kind of sound that would land wrong. She'd done everything right. It didn't matter. It never mattered when he'd made up his mind. He came to the bedroom around midnight, after she'd moved from the East Corridor to try to sleep. She heard him moving in the dressing room, and she lay very still on her side of the bed, with her hands folded under her cheek and her eyes closed, and she did the thing she'd taught herself to do. She went somewhere else in her mind. Not completely. She couldn't afford completely, but enough that the surface of her was calm. He came into the bedroom. She waited. "I know you're awake," he said. She opened her eyes. He was standing at the foot of the bed. He'd taken off his jacket. His shirt was still on, sleeves rolled up, and in the low light from the hall she could see the expression on his face, which was not angry exactly. It was something older than anger, something more patient. Anger passes. What Damien felt was different. It was more like appetite. "The permits," he said. "I thought you were going to resolve that tomorrow." "I'm not talking about the permits," he said. "I'm talking about loyalty." She sat up carefully. "Damien, who were you on the phone with last week?" "I've been on the phone with the Thursday call, 47 minutes. The number routes through a relay service." She kept her voice even. It cost her something to do it, but she did it. "That was the clinic," she said. "I've been doing prenatal consultations." "I pulled the records," he said. "The clinic's billing system shows a 12-minute appointment on Thursday at 2:15. 47 minutes is not a medical consultation." She was quiet for a moment. Her mind ran through it. The Thursday call, 47 minutes, the relay number. She had been careful. She had been so careful. And yet, "I called an old friend," she said. "Someone from before. I wanted to talk to someone who wasn't." "Don't," he said. "Don't do that." He moved around the foot of the bed. She thought about the East Corridor camera. She thought about the server. She thought about the 60-day archive. She thought about her father's voice saying, "Not yet, not yet, he'll know." Not yet, she thought. The baby isn't here yet. She thought those 4 words for the next 22 minutes. Afterward, she lay still on the bed while Damien went to the bathroom and ran the shower, and she stared at the ceiling and counted her breathing and held herself together the way you hold something broken, carefully, with pressure, knowing that if you move wrong, it comes apart. Her left side felt like someone had pressed a hot coal against it. Her wrist had a deep ache that she knew from experience would be worse by morning. She did not put her hands on her stomach until she heard the shower running. Then she pressed both palms flat and held them there. "We're okay," she said, very quietly, to the ceiling. "We're okay." The baby moved. At 12:01 in the morning, the East Corridor camera uploaded 17 hours of footage to the cloud archive. Isabella knew the upload schedule. She lay in the bed and waited for Damien to come out of the shower, listened to him get into his side of the bed, Listened to his breathing until it became the controlled, even rhythm of a man who had released what he'd been carrying and could now sleep. She waited another 40 minutes. Then she got up, slowly, carefully, and went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub in the dark and opened the tablet and logged into the archive. The footage from the East Corridor was time-stamped from 7 p.m. through the upload time. She scrubbed forward to 7:24 p.m. when she remembered standing at the window watching the storm. She pressed play. She watched. The camera angle caught the window, the settee, most of the corridor space. It caught her standing at the glass. It caught Damien when he appeared in the doorway. It caught the whole conversation, the bar cart, the bourbon, the 3 feet of space he'd used as a threat without technically making one. You couldn't hear the exact words. The camera's audio pickup was not high quality, but you could see the shape of it. The way she went still, the way he moved around the room, the way she sat when he said to sit. She scrubbed forward, past midnight. She stopped the playback. The corridor wasn't where it had happened. The East Corridor hadn't caught what happened in the bedroom. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the system settings on the archive account and looked at which cameras were linked. East Corridor, primary. She scrolled. There was a secondary feed from a camera she hadn't known about, a unit mounted in the second-floor landing covering the hallway that led to the bedroom wing. She clicked it, pulled up the footage from 12:07 a.m. through 12:31 a.m. She pressed play. The hallway camera wasn't inside the bedroom, but the bedroom door had been open, and the angle from the landing looked directly down the hall, and what the camera could see through the open doorway was partial, but it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. She watched it to the end. Then she sat in the dark on the edge of the tub for a long time, not moving, barely breathing, one hand on the tablet and one hand pressed flat against her stomach. The baby had gone still again. Outside, the storm had moved through, and somewhere in the house a clock was ticking, and Damien was sleeping, and the archive was there, and the footage was real. She thought about her father. She thought about 14 months. She thought about what he'd said on the phone in 6 minutes from Celia's kitchen. Tell me what you need. She thought about 2 months from now, when the baby would be here, and where they would be, and what life in this house would look like with an infant who would cry and couldn't be taught to calibrate its voice and would give Damien noise he didn't want in rooms he wanted quiet. She thought about what she'd told her father. Not yet. She thought now. Marcus Hale did not live the way men who'd commanded battalions were supposed to live. He lived in a house in a mid-sized city 2 states away from his daughter. A house that was too large for one person, but not by much. With a kitchen he cooked real food in, and a study with more books than any military man was supposed to have, and a dog named Sergeant who was 11 years old and moved slowly, but still slept across the doorway of whatever room Marcus was in, as if the instinct to guard had survived even into retirement. He was 63. He'd spent 31 years in military service, the last 12 of which in roles that required a kind of disciplined, systematic intelligence that was sometimes called strategy and sometimes called patience, depending on who was naming it. He had planned operations in conditions of incomplete information, under time pressure, against opponents with more resources or better cover or both. He had learned to move slowly in situations that felt urgent. He had learned that the difference between action and reaction was usually the difference between success and disaster. He had also learned that all of that discipline had edges, that there were conditions under which it failed, that the specific condition under which it failed for Marcus Hale was his daughter. The encrypted message came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Saturday. He'd given her the platform 14 months ago, right after that 6-minute call. He'd installed it on the borrowed phone himself, remotely, with the help of a man named Garrett, who'd been his intelligence officer for 9 years, and now ran a private security consulting firm out of a nondescript office building and who was one of the 3 people on Earth Marcus trusted completely. The message was short. It said, "I have footage. I'm ready." He read it twice. Then he put the phone down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. Sergeant lifted his head from the floor and looked at him, and Marcus looked back at the dog and said, "All right," in a voice that was very quiet. He didn't sleep. By 6 a.m., he had called Garrett. By 9 a.m., he had an initial conversation with an attorney named Nathan Whitaker, who specialized in cases involving organized crime defendants and who had a particular reputation for the kind of detail-oriented legal work that made prosecutors grateful and defense attorneys nervous. Whitaker had three things Marcus needed. He knew organized crime, he was discreet, and he had a standing professional relationship with a detective named Sophia Brennan who worked organized crime cases for the city's major crimes unit. Marcus did not contact any of them through channels that could be traced. He had 31 years of experience in not leaving traces. By Sunday afternoon, he had a secure video call with Whitaker and Brennan together. Brennan was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s, sharp-faced, with the particular manner of someone who'd spent years in rooms with people who were lying to her and had made her peace with it. She listened to what Marcus told her without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How long has she been documenting this?" "She only identified the secondary camera system recently," Marcus said. "But the system has been archiving automatically. If the timestamps are clean, we could have footage going back 60 days. Brennan said, "And before that?" "Her testimony." "Which is strong." "She is strong," Marcus said. There was a quality in his voice when he said it that stopped both Whitaker and Brennan from speaking for a moment. Just a pause. Then Whitaker said, "We need to look at what we have before we determine extraction timing." Marcus said, "What's your timeline for a safe exit?" Whitaker and Brennan looked at each other on the screen. Brennan said, "It depends what's in the footage." Marcus said, "I can tell you what's in the footage." Brennan said, "I know you can. That's not what I mean." She looked directly into the camera. "I mean, it depends how much we have before we move. Because once she's out, he's going to know and he's going to respond. And we need to have enough already locked down that his response doesn't matter. If we move too early..." "I understand," Marcus said. "Do you?" she said, not unkindly, just honestly. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "My daughter is 7 months pregnant." Brennan held his gaze. "I know. You understand what I'm telling you." "Yes," she said. "I do. And I'm telling you that if we move wrong, we don't get a second chance. He has too many resources. He has too many people in too many places. We need it locked before we move, General. All of it. Or we're putting her in more danger, not less." Marcus sat with that. It was the hardest kind of right to accept. He said, "What do you need from me?" Brennan said, "Get me the footage. Sub." The transfer took 4 days. It was not as simple as sending a file. The footage needed to come out of the archive account in a way that could not be traced back to Isabella, which meant routing it through a sequence of anonymous relay points that Garrett set up with the systematic care he applied to everything. The archive account itself needed to remain active and appear undisturbed. If Damien's people found evidence that a secondary camera system existed, they would either scrub it or investigate who had accessed it, and either outcome was dangerous. Garrett handled the technical extraction. Isabella fed him access credentials through the encrypted platform, one piece at a time, in messages sent from the bathroom tablet during windows when Damien was out of the house. She timed everything to his schedule, which she knew better than her own. During those 4 days, she was careful the way she'd been careful for 4 years. She made his coffee. She sat across from him at dinner and answered his questions about her day in the calibrated neutral voice she'd spent years developing. She went to her prenatal appointment on Wednesday, and the OB said the baby's position was good, weight was good, everything looked fine, and Isabella said thank you and sat in the car afterward for 3 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel before she drove home. She did not tell the OB, not yet. On Thursday evening, Garrett confirmed the transfer was complete. The footage, 17 separate files spanning 46 days of intermittent recordings, was secured in a location outside Damien's reach, in a format that maintained its chain of custody metadata and could be authenticated if it came to that. She received the confirmation at 9:14 p.m., sitting in the east corridor, in the chair nearest the window. She looked up at the corner where the camera's small red light blinked. She thought about what that light had seen. She thought about the server, about the files, about Sophia Brennan looking at them in an office somewhere and understanding what kind of man Damien Voss actually was. She thought, there are things in this world that cannot be unfound. She pressed both hands against her stomach. The baby moved under her palms. Not a kick, just a slow shift, a realignment, the way a person turns in their sleep. Outside the east corridor window, the garden was dark and still. The storm from last week had passed. The oak tree at the edge of the property was bare now, its branches stripped by the wind, and she sat and looked at it for a while. She heard Damien's footsteps in the library. She arranged her face. She arranged her hands. She arranged her breathing. But underneath the arrangement, in a place she was still learning to trust again, something had shifted, because Marcus Hale had the footage now. And Marcus Hale did not lose. What nobody understood about Marcus, not Damien's intelligence people, not the lawyers who would eventually be scrambling to understand who they were dealing with, not even some of the people who'd served under him, was that his patience was not passive. It looked like stillness. It was not stillness. It was the precise accumulation of information and positioning and timing that preceded decisive action, and it had the quality of something that appeared dormant but was not dormant at all. He spent the 2 weeks after receiving the footage building what he privately called the architecture. Sophia Brennan pulled Damien Voss's history, not the version that existed in public records, which was the version Damien's attorneys had spent years managing, but the version that existed in the spaces between public records. The pauses, the gaps, the women who had been in Damien's life before Isabella and who were no longer findable, or findable but changed. A woman named Claire, who had dated Damien for 8 months 6 years ago, and who now lived in another city under a name that was technically her middle name, working in a hospital that was far from any place she'd been before. Brennan found her. She spoke to her for 2 hours. She spoke to 3 others. She found a former Voss organization accountant named Philip Marsh, who was living quietly in a suburb and whose 2 children attended an expensive private school that cost more than his last known salary. Marsh had the particular quality of someone who had bought silence with silence and then spent years discovering that the silence never quite felt like freedom. Brennan spoke to him once and knew within 15 minutes that he would eventually cooperate. She did not push. She filed him. She came back. Whitaker began building the legal architecture in parallel. Isabella's documentation, her testimony, the footage, the medical records that existed from the 3 times she'd sought treatment for injuries with explanations that the treating physicians had noted, carefully, didn't fully account for the presentations, began taking shape as something that could stand in a room and be heard. Marcus did not participate in any of it directly. He advised. He provided context. He made 2 calls to people in positions he didn't name to Whitaker or Brennan, calls that cleared certain paths he'd identified as potentially obstructed. He didn't explain the calls. Whitaker and Brennan didn't ask. They were building something. They all understood that. And the thing about building was that you couldn't do it fast. You did it right, or you didn't do it at all. The plan that emerged over those 2 weeks had 3 phases. First, extract Isabella and secure the evidence simultaneously so that Damien had no window in which to act on either front. Second, move the legal case from preparation to active filing fast enough that Damien's attorneys couldn't get ahead of it. Third, and this was the part that Marcus thought about most at night, that he turned over in the way you turn over a problem that has no clean solution. Protect Isabella from Damien's response, which would not be rational, which would not be proportional, which would be the response of a man who had never lost anything he'd decided to keep. He had Garrett run 3 separate threat models. All 3 came back with the same finding. The window was narrow. Once Isabella was out of the house, Damien would have between 4 and 8 hours before his response would shift from internal, damage control, calls to attorneys, attempts to track Isabella's location, to external. External meant mobilizing resources. External meant people who did things for him that he never had to name directly. External meant danger of a different order. They needed to be beyond that window before he finished his first call to his attorney. Marcus looked at the threat models for a long time. Then he called Garrett and said, "We need to do this while he's out of the city." Garrett said, "He's in Miami in 3 weeks for the Solano meeting." Marcus said, 3 weeks is the timeline. Isabella did not know the exact date until 2 days before. She received a message on the encrypted platform at 6:43 a.m. on a Wednesday. 12 days. When he leaves. "Are you ready?" She sat in the bathroom with the tablet in her hands and the morning light coming in through the frosted window and the house still quiet around her. Damien still asleep on the other side of the door. She thought about what ready meant. She thought about the 4 years of things she would be leaving in this house. Some of them were things she wanted to leave. The particular quality of silence in certain rooms, the habit of listening for footsteps, the calculations she ran automatically now, angle, distance, route, the math of being in a room with someone who hurt her. But some of them were things she'd brought here. Books. A silver necklace her mother had given her before her mother died. A box of photographs. A cream-colored cardigan that was 4 years old and had a small darn patch on the left elbow that she'd repaired herself because she hadn't wanted to throw it away. She would have to leave most of it. She pressed send. I'm ready. And then she sat in the bathroom with her hands on her stomach and her eyes on the frosted window and counted the days. She counted 12 of them, one by one, the way you count anything that matters. Carefully, fully present, not wishing them faster. Because these were the last days she would spend in this house. And she wanted to remember every hour of them, so that later, when the baby was old enough to understand, she could say, I was afraid, and I did it anyway. I counted 12 days, and I walked out. On the 12th day, Damien's car left the property at 7:15 a.m. Isabella watched it go from the east corridor window. She stood there for a moment after the car disappeared, then she picked up her phone. Not the tablet. The phone. She called the number she'd memorized 14 months ago, the number she'd never dialed directly before, and when it connected, when she heard the sound of her father breathing on the other end, she said, He's gone. It's now. And Marcus Hale, who had waited 14 months for this moment, said, I'm already here. She turned away from the window, and she stopped looking at the garden. The voice on the other end of the phone was calm. That was the thing about Marcus Hale that had always unsettled people who didn't know him. He was calmest when the stakes were highest, as if danger performed some organizing function in him that ordinary life could not. Isabella had grown up thinking this was strength. She understood now that it was a kind of discipline so deeply practiced it had become structural, woven into the way he breathed and spoke and occupied space. He's gone. It's now. I'm already here, he said. East Gate, gray SUV. Garrett is with me. She looked at the east corridor window, the garden, the stripped oak, the stone terrace still wet from last night's rain. How long do I have? She said. We want to be off the property in 20 minutes. Everything we arranged is already in place. You don't need to bring much. I know. Isabella. I know, Dad. She hung up and stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. She had learned over 4 years that allowing yourself 3 seconds to feel something was not weakness. It was allocation. You gave it 3 seconds, and then you moved. She moved. The bag was already packed. She'd built it over 11 days, one item at a time. Things small enough to fit into the lining of a larger tote she kept in the back of the closet with her maternity clothes. The OB's contact information. Her passport. A copy of the medical record she'd requested under the pretense of switching providers. A thumb drive Garrett had sent her through a courier service that Damien's people didn't monitor, which contained encrypted copies of everything she'd pulled from the archive account. The cream-colored cardigan with the darn patch on the left elbow. She left the jewelry, she left the clothes, she left the books on the nightstand and the photographs on the dresser, and the life Damien had furnished around her like a set built for a character she no longer wanted to play. She walked through the bedroom one time. She didn't stop. In the hallway, she passed the door to the room that had been designated as the nursery. Painted a soft gray-green, crib already assembled. The mobile Damien had chosen still in its box because she'd never opened it. She stopped in the doorway of that room for 2 seconds. Not 3. 2. Then she kept walking. Papa. Garrett was out of the SUV before she reached the gate. He was a large man, quiet, in the particular way that large men who had spent years doing careful work tended to be quiet. And he took the tote from her shoulder without asking and put one hand briefly on her arm, not gripping, just present, and said, Easy, take your time. We have 20 minutes, she said. 19 now, you're fine. He opened the rear door of the SUV. Marcus was in the front passenger seat. He turned when she got in, and she saw his face for the first time in 14 months. And she had prepared for this. She had told herself she was prepared for this. And it turned out she was not completely prepared for this. He looked older. Not badly older. Not broken. but older the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and gotten good at not showing it. He looked at her. His eyes moved over her face, her wrist where she knew the bruising was still faintly visible, her stomach. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You look like your mother." She said, "You look tired." "I am tired." Garrett got in and pulled the gate shut behind them, and the SUV moved down the service road. Isabella turned and looked back through the rear window. The house was visible for approximately 40 seconds before the tree line took it. She watched it until she couldn't see it anymore. She turned forward. "Where are we going?" she said. "Safe house first," Marcus said. "Whitaker is meeting us there with Brennan. We need your statement formalized before the filing goes through, and we need to document—" He stopped. Restarted. "We need a physician to examine you. For the record." She said, "Okay." "Isabella, I said okay, Dad." She put her hands in her lap. "Tell me what comes next." The safe house was a 2-story rental property in a neighborhood that was ordinary in every visible way. A neighborhood of people who went to work and came home and had no particular reason to notice what happened in the house on the corner with the gray shutters. Whitaker was already inside when they arrived. He was a compact man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the deliberate manner of someone who had long ago learned that moving slowly through complicated situations was faster in the end. Brennan was there too. She was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee she wasn't drinking, and when Isabella walked through the door, Brennan looked at her the way she'd looked at the camera during the video call. Directly, without flinching, with the particular quality of attention that doesn't soften what it sees but doesn't harden against it either. "Miss Moretti," she said. "Isabella," Isabella said. "Please." "Isabella." Brennan set down the coffee. "I want you to know that I've reviewed all 17 files. I know what you went through to get them out. That took—" She stopped. "That took a lot." Isabella looked at her for a moment. "Did you have enough?" Brennan said, "We have enough." The physician arrived 20 minutes later, a woman named Dr. Carmen Wells, who worked with a domestic violence advocacy organization that Whitaker had a long relationship with and who had the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had done this many times and understood that her job in these moments was not to react, but to be steady. She examined Isabella in one of the upstairs bedrooms while Marcus sat in the hallway outside with his hands on his knees, not moving. Isabella could hear him out there, the particular quality of his stillness. "Your ribs," Dr. Wells said quietly. "This one here. Does it hurt when you breathe deeply?" "It's been about 2 weeks. It's better." "Better doesn't mean healed." Wells made a note. "I want to document the wrist. Can you tell me approximately when this happened?" "Friday night." "So 6 days ago." "Yes." Wells was quiet for a moment. Her pen moved. "How long has this been going on?" she said, and her voice was the same, steady, not soft, not hard, just present. Isabella looked at the ceiling. 4 years, she said, but the last 8 months were different, since the pregnancy. Different how? More controlled, Isabella said, more deliberate. He was careful about— She stopped. He always knew where the baby was. When he was always aware of the baby. Wells put down her pen. She looked at Isabella directly and said, "That is going to matter," Isabella said. "I know." Downstairs, Whitaker was on a call that he'd stepped onto the back porch to take, his voice low and clipped through the glass door. Garrett had positioned himself near the front window in a way that looked casual and was not. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad he wasn't writing on. Brennan sat across from him. "He's going to know by this afternoon," she said. "His people do a property check at noon when he's traveling." "I know." "When he knows, the first call he makes is to his attorney. The second call—" "I know who the second call is to," Marcus said. Brennan looked at him. "With respect, General." "Marcus." "With respect." She leaned forward slightly. "I need to know that you're going to let this work the way it needs to work. Because the way this needs to work does not involve you making calls to people who do things I can't document. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. His jaw was tight. "You're telling me to stay in my lane." I'm telling you that you are not the asset here. Isabella is the asset. The footage is the asset. Your military contacts and your 30 years of whatever it is you did in rooms I don't have clearance for, that is not the asset. That is a liability if it gets near this case and Damien's attorneys find out about it. Marcus looked at her for a long time. He said, "There are two men in this city who handle Damien's external problems. Their names are Costa and Reyes. They don't appear in any of your organized crime files because Damien has never used them against anyone who is going to talk about it afterward." Brennan held his gaze. "I'm aware of them." "Then you're aware that the gap between Damien knowing she's gone and Costa and Reyes receiving instructions is shorter than your legal timeline. Which is why we filed 40 minutes ago," Brennan said. Marcus went still. "What?" "Whitaker filed the emergency protective order 40 minutes ago, the moment you confirmed she was out of the house." She paused. "The moment Damien finds out she's gone, he is already in violation of an active legal order if he moves against her. That doesn't stop him. I know it doesn't stop him, but it means that every move he makes from this point is documented, tracked, and prosecutable. It changes the math for Costa and Reyes. Men like that don't work for clients who are actively under legal scrutiny and losing. They work for men who win." She leaned back. "So the best thing you can do right now, Marcus, is sit at this table and let it work." He sat at the table. He didn't look happy about it. Brennan picked up her coffee. Isabella came downstairs at noon. She had changed into the cardigan. She moved slowly on the stairs, and Garrett was at the bottom before she'd taken 3 steps, not touching her, just present, and she reached the bottom and stood for a moment with one hand on the newel post. "He knows," she said. Everyone in the room looked at her. "His phone." She held up her own. "He added a tracking app to it during the 2nd month of my pregnancy. I found it 8 months ago. I've known it was there. I've been careful about where I took the phone." She set it on the table, face up. "But he's going to check it and see that I haven't moved from this address, and this address is not our house, and he's going to know in approximately—" "It doesn't matter," Brennan said, already on her feet. "Garrett, there's a secondary protocol," Garrett said. He was already pulling a different phone from his jacket. "We anticipated the tracking scenario. We have a relay running from the property to a commercial address across the city. As far as his app is concerned, this phone is still on the estate." Isabella stared at him. "For how long?" she said. "Until we kill the signal manually. Could be hours. Could be until he's back in the city and goes to the property himself." Garrett looked at her steadily. "You've been carrying that phone for 8 months knowing it was tracked." "Yes." "And you brought it here." "I thought—" "It's all right," he said. "The relay is running. You did good, Isabella. You did fine." She sat down at the table. She pressed both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Her hands, the faint yellow-brown of the bruising still visible on her left wrist. Whitaker came in from the back porch and looked at the group and said, "The filing is confirmed. We're on record. What did I miss?" What Damien Voss missed at noon was not the tracking app. He missed the phone call from his property manager, a man named Elias, who had worked for the estate for 7 years, and who had found the property empty in a way that was different from the ordinary empty of a house whose owner was traveling. Not just Isabel absent, which was not unusual. She had appointments, she went places. She was not a prisoner in the technical sense. She had a car and she used it, but empty in a particular way. A few coat hangers on the floor of her closet, the bathroom counter clear of her things, a drawer in the nursery that had been open and then apparently reconsidered because it was closed but not fully latched. Elias called the estate's head of security before he called Damien. His name was Torrance, and Torrance had been with Damien for 11 years, and he had the quality that Damien valued most in the people around him. He understood that his job was not to manage situations, but to manage information. To decide what went up and what didn't, and how it was framed when it went up. He looked at the empty closet hangers. He looked at the bathroom counter. He walked through the house for 4 minutes. Then he called Damien. Damien was in a restaurant in Miami, 2 hours into a lunch that had been going well. He picked up on the second ring because Torrance never called during meals unless it was something that couldn't wait, and something that couldn't wait from Torrance meant something structural had shifted. "Talk," he said. Torrance talked for 90 seconds. Damien was quiet for approximately 4 of them after Torrance finished. The tracking app, he said, showing the estate address. Which means she left the phone. Or she's on the property and not in the house. Check the grounds. Already checking, Damien stood up from the table. The man across from him, Solano, who he'd been building toward a supply chain agreement with for the past 3 months, looked up. Damien said, "Give me 20 minutes." In the tone that made 20 minutes mean 20 minutes. And he walked out of the restaurant onto the sidewalk in the Miami sun and stood there with the phone against his ear and his free hand in his pocket. He was thinking, not panicking. Damien Voss did not panic. Panic was for people who hadn't anticipated consequences. He had anticipated many consequences. He had not, until this moment, considered this particular one as a genuine possibility because he had been careful. He had been thorough. He had managed Isabella the way you manage something valuable, controlling access, limiting exposure, maintaining the conditions necessary for containment. He thought about 14 months of careful management and asked himself what he'd missed. He thought about the Thursday call, 47 minutes, the relay service. He thought about the East Corridor, Isabella standing at the window, the way she'd been carrying herself the last 2 weeks. The same as always, neutral and careful, but with a quality he hadn't been able to name. He'd read it as fear. He'd read it as compliance. He was reconsidering the reading now. Torrance came back on the line. "She's not on the grounds." Damien said, "Get me Peterson." Already calling him. "And get me Reyes." A pause. "You're sure?" "Make the call," Damien said. He went back into the restaurant. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He looked at Solano and said, "My apologies. Family matter." Solano, who had his own complicated family matters and understood the code, nodded. Damien ate for 40 more minutes and said nothing about Isabella, and said nothing about the property, and said nothing about Reyes. And when the lunch concluded and the handshakes were made, and the understanding between them was sealed in the way that such understandings were sealed, not in writing, not in front of witnesses, just in the particular silence of men who knew what the other one would do, Damien walked to his car and sat in the back seat and felt something he had not felt since he was 19 years old. He felt like something had moved that he had not moved. He did not have a word for what this was. He had spent 42 years making sure he never needed one. At 2:17 p.m., Whitaker got the call from his contact at the courthouse. He came into the kitchen where Isabella was sitting with a cup of tea she'd been holding long enough that it was cold, and he sat down across from her and said, "The emergency protective order has been served. It was transmitted to his attorney's office in Miami 22 minutes ago." Isabella set down the cup, and his attorney called him. "Almost certainly." "So he knows. He knows about the order. He knows you have legal representation. He doesn't know yet the full scope of what we have." Whitaker paused. "But he will. His attorneys are good. They're going to start working on what you had access to and what you could have documented, and they're going to move toward the surveillance system, and when they get there—" "The secondary system is clean," Garrett said from the doorway. "There's nothing on the estate network that shows the archive account was ever accessed." "They'll find the camera," Whitaker said. "Yes, but finding the camera and proving what was on it are two different problems, and by the time they're arguing about that, we'll already be in front of a judge." Marcus came in from the front room. He'd been on his phone, and he had the look of someone who had just finished a conversation that had confirmed something they already knew. He sat down and looked at Brennan. "Costa flew to Miami this morning," he said. The room went quiet. Brennan looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching Costa's movements for 2 weeks," Marcus said, in the tone of someone delivering information and not inviting commentary on how they'd obtained it. Brennan opened her mouth. Marcus said, "I know what you told me. I'm not telling you what I did. I'm telling you what I know. Costa is in Miami, which means Damien didn't send him, which means Costa was already there, which means this was prearranged, which means somewhere in Damien's contingency planning, there was a scenario in which something went wrong with Isabella, and he needed someone in his physical proximity who could—" He stopped. "We need to move her. Tonight. Not tomorrow." Brennan was already on her phone. Whitaker looked at Isabella. She looked back at him. "Where?" she said. "Somewhere with no connection to anyone in this room," Whitaker said. "We have a protocol for this. It's been used before. With someone this connected? Whitaker held her gaze. No, he said honestly. Not with someone this connected. She nodded slowly. Her hands were on the table again, flat, still, the bruised wrist face up, without her seeming to notice. Then we'd better be careful, she said. Marcus looked at his daughter across the table, and what crossed his face in that moment was something that had no name in military terminology, something that was not strategy or patience or discipline. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then he looked at Brennan and said, "What do you need?" "I need 2 hours," Brennan said. "You have 90 minutes, Marcus said. From the front of the house, Garrett's voice came quiet and even. Someone just parked across the street. Every person in the room stopped moving. Brennan looked at Garrett. "Make?" "Black sedan, engine running, no plates visible from this angle." Whitaker stood up. Marcus was already on his feet. Isabella looked at the cold cup of tea in front of her. She thought, he found me. She thought, no. She thought, not yet. The sedan didn't move. Garrett stood at the edge of the front window with his body angled away from the glass, watching through the 3-inch gap between the curtain and the frame. His breathing was controlled. Everything else about him was controlled. Only his right hand had shifted position, and it had shifted toward his jacket in a way that was not dramatic, just present, just factual, the way a tool moves toward a hand that might need it. "Still running," he said, driver's side. "I can't see the passenger side from this angle." Brennan moved to the hallway, putting the wall between herself and the front of the house. She had her phone up. "I'm running the street camera now. Whitaker, get her upstairs." "I'm not going upstairs," Isabella said. Everyone looked at her. She was still sitting at the table. She hadn't moved. Her hands were flat on the surface, and her voice was level, and she said it again, the same way. "I'm not going upstairs. If something is happening, I want to know what it is." Marcus said, "Isabella, don't." She looked at him. "Don't manage me. Tell me what's happening." He looked at her for 1 second. 2. Then he turned to Garrett. "Can you get eyes on the plate without exposure?" "I need to go out the back and come around." "Do it." Garrett was gone from the room before Marcus finished the sentence. The 90 seconds that followed had the particular quality of time that stretches without actually slowing. Each moment complete and separate, the house very quiet, the refrigerator hum suddenly audible, the sound of Brennan's thumb moving across her phone screen. Whitaker stood near the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, not because he was comfortable, but because standing with your arms crossed gave you something to do with your hands when there was nothing to do with your hands. Isabella watched the front hallway. She was thinking about the baby, not in a panicked way. She had moved past panic somewhere in the last 6 hours, past it into something harder and quieter, a place where fear was still present but was not in charge. She was thinking about the baby the way you think about something you are responsible for, practically, specifically, without sentiment. The baby needed her to make correct decisions. That was the whole of it. Brennan said, "Street camera is showing the sedan." She looked up from the phone. "City plates. It's a city vehicle." She paused. "It's a surveillance unit. My department." The room shifted. Marcus turned. "Your department put a car on this location?" Brennan's face did something complicated. "I didn't authorize that." "Then who did?" She was already dialing. She put the phone to her ear and walked to the back of the house, and everyone in the room listened to the half of the conversation they could hear, which was short and mostly silence on Brennan's end, and when she came back, her jaw was set in a way that made Whitaker take 1 step backward. "It's Hargrove," she said. Marcus said, "Who is Hargrove?" "My lieutenant." She put the phone in her pocket. "He runs surveillance coordination for the division. He wouldn't have put a car here without authorization from above him, which means someone above him knew about this location." She stopped. "Which means someone in my chain of command knew we were here." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Whitaker said very quietly, "How many people knew this address?" Brennan looked at him. "You, me, Marcus, Garrett, Dr. Wells." "Wells is clean," Marcus said. "I know Wells is clean." "Then we have a problem that is not Wells." Brennan was quiet. Isabella said, "How long has the car been there?" Brennan looked at her. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, the expression of someone absorbing information that implicates them by proximity. Based on the street camera timestamp, she paused. 2 hours and 14 minutes. 2 hours and 14 minutes. Isabella thought about that. She ran it backward. 2 hours and 14 minutes ago, she had been upstairs with Dr. Wells. The filing had just been confirmed. Damien's attorney had just received the protective order. She said, "Someone told Damien's people where we were within the first hour." No one answered her, which was an answer. Garrett came back through the kitchen door, quiet and quick, and read the room in approximately 1 second. "It's city surveillance," he said. "I got the unit number off the plate." "I know," Brennan said. Garrett looked at her, then at Marcus. "Who burned the location?" Marcus said, "We're working on that." "We need to move her regardless," Garrett said. "Whether the car is a threat or an observation unit, staying here is done." "Agreed," Whitaker said. Isabella stood up. She picked up her tote from the floor beside her chair and slung it over her shoulder and looked at the group. Marcus, Garrett, Whitaker, Brennan. And something in the way she looked at them made Marcus go still for a moment, because it was the look of someone doing a rapid and unsentimental assessment of who in the room she could fully trust. And the assessment was visible on her face because she had stopped hiding things. Because she was done hiding things. Because 4 years of hiding things had brought her to a safe house with a surveillance unit outside and a leak she couldn't locate. She said, "Who knew we were coming here before we arrived?" Whitaker said, "I arranged the property. Brennan and I discussed the location the day before yesterday." Who else was in that conversation? Whitaker and Brennan looked at each other. "Hargrove was in the building," Brennan said slowly. "The day before yesterday. I took the call in my office, not a conference room, but..." She stopped. "My office doesn't have a closed door. It's a glass partition. So Hargrove could have heard the address. He could have heard enough. And Hargrove has a relationship with someone in Damien's organization." "I don't know that." "But you suspect it," Isabella said. "You suspected something like it before today." Brennan held her gaze. "There have been cases," she said carefully, "where information moved faster than it should have. I attributed it to other things. I may have attributed it incorrectly." The room was very quiet. Marcus said, "We need to have this conversation somewhere else." They left through the back. Garrett's second vehicle was a nondescript white van parked in the alley behind the property, and they moved to it in a sequence that was organized without anyone visibly organizing it. Marcus and Isabella first, Garrett ahead of them, Whitaker behind, Brennan last after locking the safe house and pocketing the key with the particular efficiency of someone closing a door on a mistake. The van had blacked out rear windows and no identifying features. Isabella got in and sat against the side wall on a bench seat, and Marcus sat across from her, and the van began moving before Whitaker had fully pulled the side door shut. Garrett drove without asking for directions, which meant he'd had a secondary location prepared, which meant he'd anticipated that the first one might be compromised, which meant Marcus had told him to. She looked at her father. He looked back. She said, "You thought this might happen." "I thought it was possible." "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you had enough to carry." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, at the blacked-out window, at her own faint reflection in the dark glass. "Tell me what you know about Hargrove," she said. Brennan, who was sitting near the back door, said, "He's been in the division for 9 years. His record is clean, but 9 years is a long time, and clean records don't always mean what they're supposed to mean." She paused. "If Damien has had someone inside organized crime investigations for any significant period of time, that would explain certain things about how cases against his organization have developed, or not developed." "Cases that went nowhere," Marcus said. "Cases that should have gone somewhere," Brennan corrected. "There's a difference. Cases that went nowhere might just be bad luck or bad evidence. Cases that should have gone somewhere and didn't..." She stopped. "There was a witness 4 years ago. A former Voss accountant. The case was building and the witness recanted. Completely. Changed his entire statement. The official explanation was that he'd been credibly threatened." She looked at her hands. I always thought the threat was more specific than we'd identified. I thought someone had told Damien's people exactly what the witness had given us before the threat was made. Garrett said from the front, without turning around, Philip Marsh. The van was quiet. Whitaker said, Marsh is one of our cooperating witnesses. Brennan turned and looked at the back of Garrett's head. How do you know that name? Marcus put together a profile of potential cooperators 2 weeks ago, Garrett said. Marsh was on the list. Brennan turned to Marcus. You built a cooperator list? Yes. Without telling me. Marcus said nothing. You built a list of witnesses who might cooperate against Damien Voss, and you didn't share it with the detective running the investigation. I shared what was necessary, Marcus said. Brennan's voice went flat. That is exactly the kind of decision that gets people killed, Marcus. If you identified Marsh and Damien's people got wind that you were looking at former employees, my methods were clean. Your methods, Brennan said, and there was something in her voice now that was not anger exactly, but was the tightly controlled cousin of it, are the methods of someone who spent 30 years in an environment where the rules were different. This is not that environment. This is a legal case, and if you have been conducting independent intelligence operations that touch witnesses in this case, you have potentially compromised. Enough, Isabella said. Both of them stopped. She was looking at neither of them. She was looking at the floor of the van, at a fixed point somewhere near her feet, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet, but had an edge in it, like a tool used too long without rest. Save it, she said. Work it out later. Right now I need to know if Philip Marsh is safe. Whitaker pulled out his phone. Philip Marsh was not answering his phone. Whitaker tried 3 times. The direct number, the secondary number, the number for Marsh's wife. The wife's number rang once and then went to voicemail, which was the kind of thing that meant either nothing or something very bad, and in the context of this particular afternoon, it was hard to believe it meant nothing. Marcus said, Garrett! On it, Garrett said. He made a call from the front of the van, speaking quietly, and the conversation lasted 40 seconds. When he ended it, he said, I have someone 20 minutes from Marsh's address. We'll know something shortly. Brennan said, Who are these people you have? People, Garrett said. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have. Whitaker put his phone away. He looked at Isabella. Are you all right? I'm fine. Isabella, I'm fine, Nathan. She used his first name deliberately, and he understood from the way she said it that she was not inviting more of the question. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had left her home 6 hours ago, and the safe house had lasted less than 3 hours. And somewhere in Damien Voss's Miami hotel room, a man named Costa was waiting for instructions, and she was fine because being fine was the only available option. She pressed her hands against her stomach. The baby was still. Garrett's contact reached Marsh's neighborhood in 18 minutes. The report came back in 4 words. House is dark. Police. Garrett said it aloud, and the van went very quiet. Brennan said, What kind of police? 2 units, unmarked car, the kind of response that comes after something has already happened, not before. Isabella put one hand over her mouth, just for a moment. Then she lowered it. Whitaker said, We don't know what this is yet. We know what it is, Marcus said. His voice was very controlled, which meant he was very angry, which was a combination that Isabella had seen only a handful of times in her life, and which meant that he was deciding something, and that whatever he decided, it would not be small. Brennan had her phone out. She was making a call, low and rapid, and she listened for a moment, and then she said very quietly, All right, and ended the call. She looked at the group. Philip Marsh is in a hospital, she said. He was found in his car on a street 6 blocks from his house at approximately 1:40 this afternoon. His wife is with him. She paused. He's alive. He is not fully conscious. The van was silent except for the road noise. Isabella thought, 1:40? She thought the protective order was transmitted to Damien's attorney at 1:55. She thought about what that sequence meant, that Marsh had been found before the order was served, which meant whoever had moved against Marsh had moved without knowing the legal case had been filed, which meant they'd been monitoring Marsh independently of what happened with her today, which meant, He wasn't targeted because of me, she said. Everyone looked at her. The timing, she said. Marsh was found at 1:40. The order didn't go out until 1:55. Damien didn't know I'd left until afternoon. There wasn't enough time for him to connect me to Marsh and respond in that window. She looked at Brennan. Marsh was already a target before today. Someone told Damien that Marsh was talking. Brennan's face went still. Hargrove, she said. How long ago did your people make contact with Marsh? Isabella said. Brennan said, very slowly, 10 days ago. And Hargrove has been in the building this entire time. The van made a turn, and the light changed inside it, and for a moment everyone sat with what that meant. 10 days. Hargrove had 10 days to pass information to Damien's organization. 10 days during which the case against Damien was being built in a building where Hargrove worked behind a glass partition that didn't have a closed door. Whitaker said, what else did Hargrove have access to? Brennan looked at him, and she didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer, and Whitaker said again, more quietly, Sophia, what else? The footage, she said. I logged the evidence files into the department system 3 days ago. Standard procedure. The log includes a description of the files and their evidentiary basis. She stopped. It doesn't include the source, but it describes the camera system. Marcus said, the secondary camera system. Yes. Marcus stood up in the moving van, which meant he was too tall for the space, and he pressed one hand against the ceiling and looked at Brennan with an expression that was the stillness that comes after something breaks. He knows about the camera, Marcus said. He may know. He knows. If Hargrove saw the log, he knows there's a secondary system. He knows it's been running. He knows we have footage. He looked at her. And if he knows that, he knows the footage exists on a server somewhere. And if he knows that, the next call Damien makes is not to Costa and Reyes. It's to the one person who has the technical capability to find that server and scrub it. The van stopped. They had arrived somewhere. A parking structure, concrete pillars, low light, the sound of the engine cutting out. Isabella said, the archive. Is the archive safe? Garrett said, it was safe as of this morning. That's not what I asked. He turned from the front seat and looked at her directly. The account was created under a false identity that has no connection to you, to Marcus, or to this case. The server is hosted offshore. Getting to it requires... Damien has people who do things that require, Isabella said. Garrett held her gaze. He did not argue. Whitaker said, we need to make a decision right now about the timeline. If the footage is at risk, we have to move the filing forward. We have to go in front of a judge with what we have before Damien's people find that server. Moving the timeline up means less preparation, Brennan said. Yes. Less preparation means, I know what it means, Whitaker said. Isabella said, how long? Whitaker looked at her. How long to move the filing forward? How long to get in front of a judge? Give me a number. If we go tomorrow morning, if I file tonight and request an emergency hearing, we're looking at a morning session, possibly 8 a.m., possibly later depending on the docket. And the footage, she said. Can you authenticate what we already have in time for tomorrow morning? What we have on the thumb drive, yes. The archive. He paused. We'd need to pull selected files tonight and get them authenticated overnight. It's possible, but it requires... Do it, Isabella said. Whitaker looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his daughter. She said, don't look at him. I'm the one standing in this case. I'm the witness. I'm making the decision. She held Whitaker's gaze. Do it. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, all right. Well, they set up in the parking structure for 11 minutes while Garrett made calls and Whitaker drafted emergency documents on a tablet. And Brennan stood near the vehicle entrance watching the street, her hand near her jacket in the same way Garrett's had been near his earlier. Present, factual, ready, without being ready for anything specific yet. Marcus sat beside Isabella on the bench seat of the van with the side door open. They didn't talk for a while. Then he said, I should have told you about the Hargrove possibility. She said, yes. I was managing it. I know you were. She looked at her hands. That's the problem. He was quiet. You managed me for 14 months, she said. You managed the information. You decided what I could carry and what you'd carry for me, and I let you do it because I was... She stopped, started again. Because asking you to stop felt like asking you to stop being you, and I didn't have the energy, and I trusted you. She looked at him. I still trust you. But I'm done being managed by anyone. Marcus looked at his hands. His hands were large and showed his age in a way his face didn't quite, and he looked at them for a long moment. Your mother used to say the same thing, he said. I know, Isabella said. You managed her too. I know I did. They sat with that. Outside, Brennan said something quietly into her phone. Whitaker's thumb moved across the tablet. Garrett had moved somewhere out of sight. The baby shifted. Isabella put her hand on her stomach and felt the movement and held her breath for a second, waiting for it to resolve into something specific, a kick, a turn. But it didn't resolve. It continued. A long, slow restlessness, the baby moving the way people move in the middle of the night when sleep won't hold. He's going to come after the hearing, she said. Marcus said, yes. The courtroom won't stop him. No. So what does? Marcus looked at her. The same thing that stops any man who's built everything on the belief that he's untouchable. She waited. Losing, he said, publicly, completely, in a room full of people who write it down. She thought about Damien in Miami, in a restaurant, eating calmly after Torrance called him. She thought about the way he'd sat across from her at 100 dinners and never once looked like a man who expected the world to stop cooperating with him. She thought about the 4 years of rooms she'd measured by their exits and the 11 nights she'd counted down and the footage on a server somewhere offshore that right now might be intact or might be gone, depending on how fast Damien's people moved and how good they were at finding things in places that were supposed to be unfindable. She thought, what happens to a man like that when he loses? She thought, I don't know. She thought, I'm about to find out. Garrett reappeared at the mouth of the parking structure, and he was moving quickly, which was not his normal register, and when he reached the van, his face had the particular quality of someone delivering information they'd rather not deliver cleanly. The archive account, he said. Everyone stopped. Someone ran a query on the server host 6 minutes ago, he said, looking for accounts matching the registration parameters. He looked at Isabella. They haven't found it yet, but the query was specific enough that they know what they're looking for. They have the server host, they have the account structure. He paused. They don't have the account ID yet, but the window is... How long? Marcus said. Garrett said, an hour, maybe less. Whitaker was already pulling files. Brennan was on her phone calling someone who could authenticate digital evidence at 11 o'clock at night. Marcus stood up and his hand was on his own phone, and his jaw was set in the way that meant he was making decisions that were not going to be discussed before they were made. And Isabella looked at all of them. Her father, the attorney, the detective, the man who had carried a tote bag and positioned himself near exits and driven a van that had a secondary location prepared. And she understood in this moment that the plan they had built over 2 weeks with its careful phases and its legal architecture and its controlled timeline was gone. What they had now was 1 hour. 1 hour to pull what they needed from the archive before Damien's people found it and burned it. 1 hour to make the case they'd been building for 2 weeks into something that could survive tomorrow morning without the full archive behind it. 1 hour to become, all of them, something faster and less careful and more exposed than any of them had planned to be. She said, "Give me the tablet." Whitaker handed it to her without hesitation. She looked at the archive login screen she'd opened. She typed her credentials. The account loaded. All 17 files were still there, timestamps intact, metadata clean, 62 gigabytes of footage that showed exactly what kind of man Damien Voss was behind the walls of a house that everyone on the outside thought was a home. She started downloading. Her hands did not shake. Part 4 của kịch bản điện ảnh này được triển khai với dung lượng 3.500 đến 4.000 từ, bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 3. Trọng tâm tuyệt đối là cao trào bùng nổ, the peak of action và stakes. Mỗi mâu thuẫn từ các phần trước giờ đây hội tụ thành một cuộc đối đầu trực diện, không khoan nhượng. Nhịp điệu kịch bản phải cực kỳ dồn dập, căng thẳng đến mức nghẹt thở. Duy trì giọng văn mỹ thô ráp,
tập trung vào những chi tiết bản năng, tiếng tim đập, sự đau đớn thể xác, mồ hôi hòa lẫn máu và sự quyết liệt trong ánh mắt. Nhân vật phải thực hiện những lựa chọn liều lĩnh nhất, chấp nhận đánh đổi mọi thứ để đạt được mục tiêu. Hội thoại trong phần này cần gãy gọn, sắc bén, đôi khi là những tiếng hét hoặc những lời nói đứt quãng vì kiệt sức, triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh hành động hoặc đối đầu tâm lý, scene by scene. Tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Kết thúc Part 4 ở đỉnh điểm kịch tính, ngay trước khi trận chiến cuối cùng ngã ngũ. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi, hãy dừng lại ở một câu rạng rỡ để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp. Tri dân bắt buộc. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dụng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show More Part 4. She downloaded for 38 minutes.
The tablet's connection was running through Garrett's mobile hotspot, and the speed was not good. Not bad. Not good. The kind of speed that makes you watch a progress bar and do math you don't want to do. 62 gigabytes. 38 minutes in, they had 41 gigabytes secured to the encrypted drive Whitaker had produced from his bag. 21 gigabytes remaining. The progress bar moved in increments that felt geological. Isabella watched it. She did not look up from it. Around her, the parking structure had become its own ecosystem. Brennan on a call in the far corner, her voice a low, continuous murmur that had the cadence of someone talking to a judge's clerk. Whitaker cross-legged on the concrete floor with his tablet across his knees, building the emergency filing document piece by piece, asking Isabella questions every few minutes without looking up from his screen. What date? What time? Which room? She answered each question without looking away from the progress bar. Marcus stood near the vehicle entrance. He hadn't moved from that position in 20 minutes. He was watching the street and he was thinking, and the combination made him look like a statue of something that was not yet finished being decided. Garrett crouched near Isabella's bench seat. He was watching the download progress on his own screen, the server-side view, showing the account activity, showing whether anyone else was looking. Still clean, he said, every 4 minutes or so. Not to reassure her, just as information. Still clean. Still clean. At the 41-minute mark, he said, "Query hit." Isabella's eyes moved to him. "They found the server-host account structure," he said. "They're running account ID permutations now. Automated. They're close." He looked at the progress bar. 11 gigabytes. How long until they have the ID? At the current query rate? He did the math without a calculator. 14 minutes? Maybe 12. 11 gigabytes in 12 minutes. She looked at Whitaker. "What do you need minimum? For tomorrow? What files can you not go in without?" Whitaker looked up. He'd been listening. The November recordings, the hallway footage from the landing, the bedroom approach sequence. He paused. And the incident from March, the one Dr. Wells referenced in her examination notes. "If that's in the archive, March 14th, Isabella said, it's file 9. Then file 9 is non-negotiable. Everything else we can work around." She looked at Garrett. "Can we priority pull specific files? Jump the queue on the download." Garrett was already moving. "Give me the file numbers." She told him. He worked for 90 seconds, fingers moving fast, and then he said, "Redirected. Priority files are downloading now. They'll complete first, then the queue resumes." He looked up. "If we lose the connection before the full archive is secured, we have what you need for tomorrow." She exhaled. One breath. Controlled. Then back to watching. At the 47-minute mark, with 6 gigabytes remaining in the queue, Garrett said very quietly, "They have the account ID." The download had 8 minutes left at current speed. "How long until they can access the account?" Isabella said. "They need to crack the two-factor. If they have someone good, how long?" 6 minutes, maybe 8. 6 gigabytes, 6 minutes. She looked at the progress bar. She said, "Can we increase the download speed? We're already at capacity on the hotspot." "Then we lose the last 6 gigabytes." Garrett said, The priority files are already secured. What's left in the queue is supplementary footage, context material. It strengthens the case, but it isn't the case. Isabella said, "Pull the connection." Everyone stopped. Whitaker looked up. She said it again. "Pull the connection to the archive, now, before they get in. If they access the account, they can see the download activity. They can see what we pulled and trace the connection endpoint." Garrett held her gaze for 1 second. Then he looked at Marcus. "Don't look at him," she said. "I'm telling you to pull it." Garrett pulled it. The progress bar froze at 56 gigabytes. The account went dark. And somewhere, on a server that Damien's people were 6 minutes away from accessing, 62 gigabytes of footage sat in an account that would now look, to anyone who got inside it, completely untouched. No download activity, no recent access. Just 17 archived files and 60 days of automated uploads and a small red indicator light blinking in the corner of an east corridor that nobody was ever supposed to notice. Let them find it, Isabella thought. Let them think they found it first. Let them delete it. Because the 56 gigabytes that mattered were already somewhere else. Whitaker filed at 11:47 p.m. He filed from the parking structure floor, cross-legged on concrete, with his jacket folded under him and his reading glasses pushed up and his tablet connected to the court's emergency filing system through a VPN that Garrett had set up in approximately 4 minutes. The filing included the authenticated footage files, Dr. Wells' examination report, Isabella's sworn statement, which she had dictated to Whitaker in the parking structure over the course of 40 minutes, speaking in the same flat, precise voice she'd used to answer his questions during the download, and a chain of custody document for the digital evidence that Garrett had built to a standard that would survive scrutiny. The filing hit the court system at 11:47. The emergency hearing was assigned at 12:03 a.m., 8 a.m., courtroom 7. Whitaker read out the confirmation number and then sat for a moment on the concrete floor looking at his tablet, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who had just done something that could not be undone, which was accurate. He said, "That's it. We're in." Marcus turned from the vehicle entrance. Brennan ended her call. Isabella sat with the tablet in her hands and looked at the filing confirmation on the screen and felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. Not relief, not satisfaction, something more provisional than either, something that was the emotional equivalent of a breath taken before the next thing. She thought, "We're in." She thought, "Now he comes." Damien landed in the city at 6:14 a.m. He had cut the Miami trip short by 2 days, which was the kind of decision that cost him. Solano would read it as weakness, as instability, and the supply chain agreement they'd spent 3 months building would need to be resecured at some cost. But Damien had made the calculation, and the calculation was simple. The Solano deal could be repaired. What was happening in his city could not be managed from a hotel room in Miami. He had spent the flight doing what he did when situations became complex. He had reduced the complexity by identifying the single most important variable and focusing everything on it. The variable was the footage. His technical people had accessed the archive account at 11:53 p.m. and found it clean. No recent download activity. The files were there. They had scrubbed the account, deleted everything, closed the server connection, destroyed the account credentials, and reported to him at 12:19 a.m. that the threat was neutralized. He'd believed them. He'd slept 3 hours on the plane. Peterson had called him at 5:40 a.m., 20 minutes before landing, with the news about the court filing, and Damien had listened to the full report without interrupting and then said, "What do they have?" Peterson said, "They filed with supporting documentation. The specifics are sealed until the hearing, but the filing references digital evidence." "What kind?" "Video files. The description in the filing references a secondary recording system in the residential property." Damien was quiet. "Damien? My people told me the archive was clean." "The filing was time-stamped 11:47, Peterson said. "Your people accessed the account at 11:53. 6 minutes. The silence on Damien's end lasted long enough that Peterson said his name again. "Who's the judge?" Damien said. "Calloway." "Calloway." He said the name the way you test ice, pressure first, then listen for what it does. "What's Calloway's relationship with Hargrove's division?" That's not how this works, Damien. Calloway is... What's his relationship?" Peterson was quiet for a moment. There have been cases where Calloway's rulings aligned with outcomes that benefited the division's investigations. He's not bought, Damien said. I know who Calloway is. I'm asking whether he's the kind of judge who has already formed an opinion about what's in front of him before he sits down. Peterson said very carefully, he is the kind of judge who takes domestic violence evidence seriously. Damien looked out the plane window at the city coming up below. The water, the grid of streets, the particular way cities look from the air before dawn. All structure and no life, like the skeleton of something. 8 a.m., he said. Yes. I'll be there. Damien, I don't think I'll be there, he said again, and his voice had a quality that ended conversations. Isabella arrived at the courthouse at 7:22 a.m. She had slept 4 hours in a hotel 2 miles from the parking structure, in a room booked under Garrett's name, with Garrett sitting outside the door in a chair he'd pulled from the hallway. She'd lain on top of the covers in the dark and put her hands on her stomach and felt the baby move and had told herself, in the specific internal voice she'd developed for the worst moments, that this was almost over. She wasn't sure she believed it, but she said it. She dressed in the one change of clothes she had in the tote, dark slacks, a gray blouse, the cardigan over it, and she stood in the bathroom of the hotel looking at herself in the mirror for 20 seconds. She looked at the wrist. She looked at her face, the particular quality of exhaustion that had settled into the skin around her eyes, not the exhaustion of one bad night, but the exhaustion of years of bad nights that had finally accumulated into something visible. She thought about what Damien had always said about her in public, how she presented herself, the appearance he required her to maintain, the specific kind of beauty that was expected in his world, controlled, composed, impeccable. She left the bathroom looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had not slept, a woman who had been through something, a woman with a bruised wrist and 7 months of pregnancy and 47 hours of authenticated footage on an encrypted drive that was currently in Nathan Whitaker's inside jacket pocket. She left the bathroom and she did not fix anything else. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected. She didn't know why she'd built it larger in her head. She'd been imagining something grand and formal, the architecture of consequence, and what she got was a room with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches and the particular smell of a building that processed human difficulty all day, every day, and had absorbed some of it into the walls. Whitaker sat beside her at the plaintiff's table. Brennan was in the gallery, 2 rows back. Marcus was beside Brennan. He had wanted to sit at the table with her. She'd said no. You're a witness, she told him in the car. You sit in the gallery. You look like someone who came here to watch the process work, not someone who came here to win a fight. There's a difference, and Calloway will see it. Marcus had sat in the gallery. At 7:51 a.m., Damien's legal team arrived. 3 attorneys. She recognized Peterson from photographs, compact, gray-suited, the measured walk of someone who is always aware of being observed. Behind him were 2 younger attorneys she didn't recognize, carrying document boxes. They sat up at the defense table without looking at her. At 7:58 a.m., Damien walked in. He was alone, which surprised her, and then she understood that he had walked in alone deliberately, that the choice to enter a room without a bodyguard flanking him was itself a message about what kind of man he was, about the kind of man he had always presented himself to be. He wore a dark suit, and he walked the way he always walked, unhurried, like the room had been arranged for his arrival, and he sat down at the defense table and he looked at Isabella. She looked back. She held it. She had held his gaze in rooms that were much worse than this one, and she held it now, and she did not look away, and she did not look afraid, and something crossed his face, just a flicker, just a fraction of a second, that she had never seen there before. She looked away first, but she did it on her own schedule. She turned to Whitaker and said quietly, "Are we ready?" He said, "We're ready, Acham." Judge Calloway entered at 8:03 a.m. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the particular manner of a man who had been in this room so long that almost nothing surprised him anymore. He settled into his chair and reviewed the documents in front of him for approximately 90 seconds, which was long enough that the room stayed quiet out of something more like respect than protocol. Then he looked up. This is an emergency protective hearing on the matter of Moretti Voss versus Voss. Emergency filing received at 11:47 p.m. last night. He looked at both tables. I've reviewed the filing and the attached documentation. I have questions. Mr. Whitaker. Your Honor, the digital evidence referenced in the filing, you're claiming authenticated footage from a secondary recording system at the residential property. That's correct? Chain of custody documentation is included? Yes, Your Honor. Garrett Dunn, certified digital forensics professional, will attest to the chain of custody. His credentials and the authentication methodology are in the supporting materials. Calloway looked at Peterson. Mr. Peterson, your client contests the existence of this footage? Peterson stood. Your Honor, we contest the provenance of any purported footage, and we would note that the residential property's security system was managed by a licensed security firm whose personnel will testify that no secondary system existed outside their management protocols. The secondary system was a manufacturer's backup unit installed during the original construction of the property, Whitaker said. It was not part of the primary security contract and was not known to the security firm. Its installation records are in the discovery materials. Calloway looked at Peterson. Peterson had the expression of a man who had been told something by his client that was turning out not to be accurate. We'll address provenance, Calloway said. First, I want to hear from the petitioner. Isabella stood. She had prepared for this. Whitaker had walked her through it twice in the hotel room before they'd left. What to say? What order? How to pace it? She stood and she put her hands on the table in front of her, and for a moment she looked at the room, the fluorescent light, the gallery with Marcus and Brennan, the defense table where Peterson was making a note, and Damien was sitting with his hands folded and his face giving nothing away. She thought about the East Corridor camera, the small red light. She thought about a Tuesday morning in March, sitting across a kitchen island from a man who had already decided that the night before had not happened. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not cry. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt all of it, the whole 4 years of it. In the place below her ribs that had been clenched for so long, she'd started to think the clenching was just how that part of her body was now. She didn't cry because crying in this room felt like giving something to Damien that he did not deserve. And she was done giving Damien things he didn't deserve. She spoke clearly. She spoke specifically. She gave dates and rooms and what had been said and what had not been said, and the particular way certain things were done when they were done deliberately. She spoke about the security camera in the East Corridor, how she found it and what she did and why she waited. She spoke about her father's call and the 14 months in Celia's kitchen and the borrowed phone. She spoke about 7 months of pregnancy and what she had learned to calculate about the space between where a person stood and where she was standing. She spoke about 11 days of counting down. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Calloway looked at his documents. Then he said, Mr. Peterson, I'd like to view the footage. Todd. They set up a screen to the left of the judge's bench. It took 8 minutes to set up, during which the room had the particular charged stillness of a space in which everyone knew what was coming and no one could accelerate it. Whitaker connected the drive. Garrett, who had entered the courtroom as a witness and sat in the front row of the gallery, walked to the screen to verify the file integrity. Damien sat at the defense table with his hands folded. He had not moved significantly since he sat down. He had not conferred with Peterson in any visible way. He had the quality of a man who had decided on a posture and was holding it, because the posture was the last thing in the room that he controlled, and he understood that. Isabella sat at her table. She did not look at the screen when the footage started. She had seen it. She knew what it showed. She looked at the table in front of her and she listened to the sound of the courtroom watching it. The quality of silence that is not neutral, the kind of silence that accumulates weight as it goes on, the silence of people seeing something they cannot unhear. It ran for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. When it ended, Calloway removed his reading glasses from the chain and put them on and looked at the documents in front of him for a moment. Then he looked up. He did not look at Peterson. He did not look at Whitaker. He looked at Damien. He looked at him for approximately 4 seconds, which in a courtroom is a very long time, the kind of look that doesn't ask a question because the look itself is the answer. Then he said, I'm granting the protective order.
Peterson stood immediately. Your Honor, we would respectfully— I'm granting the protective order, Calloway said again.
The second time he said it, it was not a repetition. It was a door closing. Mr. Voss, you are to have no contact with the petitioner, direct or indirect, and you are to vacate the residential property by 5 p.m. today. Violation of this order will result in immediate detention. He looked at Peterson. Your client is aware that this proceeding is on the public record and that the evidentiary materials submitted today are now part of that record. Peterson said, Your Honor, the evidentiary materials are contested. They are on the public record, Calloway said. Counsel, I suggest you and your client have a thorough conversation about the broader implications of today's filing before this court. He looked down at his documents. We're adjourned. The gavel came down, and for 3 seconds, 3 full seconds, the courtroom was the kind of quiet that happens when something large has moved and hasn't finished moving yet. Then Peterson leaned toward Damien. Damien did not lean back toward him. He was looking at Isabella. She felt it before she turned, the specific quality of his attention, the focused, particular weight of it that she'd learned to identify the way you learn to identify a sound that means danger before you can name the danger. She turned and she looked at him. His face was still, composed. The expensive suit, the folded hands, the posture of a man who had walked into rooms his whole life and had them arrange themselves around him. All of that was still there. All of that was intact. But something behind it was not intact. She could see it. In the set of his jaw, in the quality of his eyes, in the specific kind of stillness that is not calm, but is calm's opposite. The stillness of something that is very close to breaking and is using everything it has to not break yet. She had seen that stillness before. She had seen it in smaller rooms. She held his gaze and she did not look afraid, and she did not look triumphant, and she did not look like anything he had a name for, because she had spent 4 years being categorized by this man, and she was done being something he could name. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. He put one hand on her arm. Just present, just there. And he said quietly, Let's go. She did not move immediately. She waited until she was ready. Then she turned away from Damien Voss, and she walked toward the courtroom door, and she did not look back. And behind her she heard Peterson's voice low and urgent, and Damien's voice answering, 2 words, quiet and flat. And she could not make out exactly what he said, but she heard the quality of it. It was not the voice of a man who had accepted something. Garrett caught up to her in the corridor outside the courtroom, his hand already on his phone. He made a call, Garrett said. In the courtroom. Before the gavel. She looked at him. During the footage, Garrett said. Under the table, 1 call, 40 seconds. Whitaker came through the door behind them, document bag over his shoulder, and he heard the last part, and his face went tight. Costa, he said. Or Reyes, Garrett said. Marcus said, Where is Reyes right now? Last known, Garrett was already pulling his phone. Last known was an address near the port. That was 2 days ago. Get me current. Brennan came out of the courtroom last. She had her own phone up. She said, I have a unit outside, but Damien's going to walk out of that courtroom in about 4 minutes, and I can't hold him on anything yet. The protective order is civil, not criminal, and the full criminal filing is— When does the criminal filing go in, Marcus said. This afternoon. I have everything I need from today's hearing, but this afternoon is too long, Marcus said. The corridor was filling with courthouse foot traffic around them, people with their own files, their own hearings, their own versions of days that had arrived at this building looking for resolution. Isabella stood among them and felt the baby move again. The same restless shifting from the night before, not a kick but a continuous low-level motion, like someone turning in a tight space looking for room. She put her hand on her stomach and felt it and said to Whitaker, without looking up, What does Damien do when he's already lost and he knows it? Whitaker said carefully, Historically— Not historically, she said. You've been building this case for 2 weeks. You know him now. What does he do? Whitaker was quiet for a moment. He removes the evidence, he said. Not the footage. The footage is in the court record now. It's too late for the footage. But witnesses who haven't been formally deposed yet. People who haven't given sworn testimony. He looked at her. Marsh is in the hospital. The 3 women Brennan found. Claire and the others. Are they protected? She said. We have contact information. We have preliminary statements. We don't have... Are they protected? Brennan said, Not yet. Isabella looked at her. I have people I can call in the next 30 minutes, Brennan said. But I need something to hold Damien on. Something that keeps him from walking out of this building and making calls that I can't intercept in time. She looked at Marcus. I need a reason to detain him right now. Something criminal. Something I can put in front of a uniform and say this is why we're holding him. Marcus said nothing. Brennan said, Marcus. He looked at her. She said, You told me 2 weeks ago there were people in Damien's organization who were ready to cooperate. People you'd identified, not Marsh, others. Yes. Is any one of them ready to give a sworn statement today, right now? Something I can take to a judge in the next 40 minutes and use to get a criminal hold? Marcus was quiet. In that quiet, in the corridor of the courthouse, with the foot traffic moving around them, and Damien 4 minutes from walking through that courtroom door, Garrett's phone vibrated. He looked at it. He looked up at Marcus. He said, Reyes is not at the port. He turned the phone so Marcus could see the screen, and Marcus looked at it, and something happened in his face that Isabella had seen once before in her life. The last time, she had been 9 years old, and it was the moment he'd gotten a call that meant something very bad and very close. She said, Where is he? Garrett said, 3 blocks from here. And then the courthouse door at the end of the corridor opened and Damien Voss walked through it, Peterson at his shoulder, and he looked down the corridor and found Isabella in the crowd with the specific, unhurried accuracy of a man who had always been able to find the thing he was looking for in any room. And he looked at her, and he did not say anything, and he did not move toward her, and he did not have to. Because the look itself said everything that he would not say in a corridor with courthouse witnesses and a detective, and a retired general and a man with his hand near his jacket. The look said, This is not over. And Isabella looked back at him, with her hand on her stomach and the baby moving and 47 hours of authenticated footage already in the court record, and a criminal filing going in this afternoon, and 3 blocks away a man named Reyes, who was not at the port. And she thought, You're right, it's not over. But it's not yours anymore either. And for the first time in 4 years, the difference between those two things felt like part 5. The difference felt like air. That was the closest she could get to it, standing in the courthouse corridor with Damien's eyes on her from 40 feet away, and Reyes 3 blocks out, and the baby turning slow circles under her hands. It felt like the first breath after surfacing. Not safe, not over, but air, actual air, the kind you don't have when you're under. She breathed it. Then she looked at Garrett and said, What do you need to track Reyes? Garrett said, I already am. Brennan was already moving. She had her badge out and her phone up, and she was walking toward the uniformed officer posted near the courthouse entrance, talking fast and low, and Isabella watched her go and thought, This is what it looks like when the process works. Not clean, not certain, but moving. Forward, not in circles. Marcus appeared at her left side, not touching her, just there. She said, The women Brennan found, Claire and the others. Garrett has contact information, Marcus said. He's sending it to Brennan's team now. And Marsh, still in the hospital, conscious as of an hour ago. His wife is with him. She nodded. Damien had not moved from his position at the end of the corridor. Peterson was speaking to him, low and urgent, one hand on Damien's arm. Damien was not looking at Peterson. He was looking at Isabella. He had the quality of a man conducting a calculation, and she had spent 4 years learning to read his calculations. And what she read now was not rage. Rage would have been simpler. Rage was the first thing. Rage ran out. What she read was something colder and more patient. The assessment of a man who had lost a position but had not yet lost the war in his own mind and was already mapping the next move. She understood something then that she had not fully understood before. The protective order, the footage, the court record, the criminal filing going in this afternoon, none of it would change what Damien believed about himself. Men like Damien did not revise. They maneuvered. And a man who is maneuvering is more dangerous than a man who is raging, because rage is loud and maneuvering is quiet, and quiet is where he'd always done his worst work. She turned to Marcus. He's going to go after the witnesses, she said. Not Marsh. Marsh is too visible now, too documented. He's going to go after Claire. Marcus said, Brennan? Brennan is working a chain of command that has Hargrove in it, Isabella said. How fast can Garrett get someone to Claire independently? Marcus looked at Garrett. Garrett said, I have a contact in her city. I can have someone at her address in 40 minutes. Do it now, Isabella said. Garrett did it now. Setz act. Brennan came back from the uniformed officer with a different expression than the one she'd left with. She had the look of someone who'd pushed on something and found it didn't move the way it should have. She pulled Marcus aside. Isabella followed. The officer won't hold Damien without a criminal charge in hand, Brennan said. The protective order is civil. I knew that going in. What I didn't know is that Hargrove called ahead. She said it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. There's a notation in the courthouse security system flagging our case as under internal review. That's Hargrove's language. It's a signal to anyone in the department looking at this that the case has complications. Marcus said, Can you go around him? I'm trying. I have someone above Hargrove who will listen to me, but it takes time I don't have right now. She looked at Isabella. I'm sorry. I know that's not... Stop apologizing, Isabella said. What does Damien need to do for you to have grounds to hold him? Brennan looked at her steadily. If Reyes makes a move, anything I can document as a coordinated action tied to Damien, I have conspiracy to commit. I can hold him on that. So we need Reyes to move. We need Reyes to move, and we need to catch him moving. Isabella looked down the corridor. Damien was still there, still watching. Peterson had stopped talking, which meant Peterson had run out of things to say or had said the one thing that mattered and was waiting for the response. She thought about what Damien would do next. She thought about it the way she'd thought about his moods and his rhythms and the specific weight of his footsteps in a hallway for 4 years. She had learned him the way you learn a landscape you can't leave. Every elevation, every drop, every place where the ground looks solid and wasn't. She thought, he won't move directly. He's in a courthouse. He's under a protective order. There are witnesses and cameras and a judge who just looked at him for 4 seconds with that look. He is not going to do anything in this building that is visible. He is going to walk out of this building and make one call, and then he is going to go somewhere he can be seen being somewhere else. She thought, Reyes is not going after Claire. She thought Reyes is already where he needs to be. She said, 3 blocks from here. Where does that put Reyes? Garrett looked at his phone. Corner of Merchant and 5th. She looked at Whitaker. Where's the parking structure we were in last night? Whitaker said, 4 blocks north of... He stopped. She said, the van is still there. Garrett said, the van is registered under a shell that Damien's people could have traced if they were looking for vehicles connected to... Could they have traced it? A pause. Yes. Is the encrypted drive still in the van? Another pause. Shorter. She looked at Whitaker. He was already patting his jacket pocket. He stopped. His hand stopped. He said, I had it in my jacket. He patted the other pocket. He looked up. She said very quietly, Where is the drive, Nathan? Whitaker's face had gone the color of the courthouse walls. He said, I set the document bag down in the courtroom during the footage. I set it on the floor beside the table, and when I picked it up again, the drive... Was the drive in the document bag, Garrett said. It was in a side pocket. I transferred it this morning because the inside jacket pocket was... I had the filing materials in the... Garrett was already moving toward the courtroom door. Brennan followed. Isabella stood in the corridor and looked at Whitaker, and he looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and hoped not to see again. The expression of a man confronting a mistake that might be the kind of mistake that undoes everything. She said, the court record. Whitaker said, the files are in the court record. The filing is stamped. Whatever is on that drive, the court already has authenticated copies. The record is there. He said it like he was checking his own math. The record is there. But the drive has the full archive, the 56 gigabytes. Yes. And if someone took it from your bag, the court record is untouched, he said again. The drive is additional. It's... He stopped. It matters, Isabella. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter. If Damien's people have that drive, they can see what was on the archive. They can see every file. They can see what we have and what we don't have, and they can build a defense around the gaps. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Then we don't give them time to build one." Uchunk. The drive was not in the courtroom. Garrett checked the floor beside the plaintiff's table, under the chairs, behind the screen equipment. He spoke to the courtroom clerk, who had been present throughout, and who said carefully that she had not seen anyone approach the document bag, but that there had been a period during the footage playback when the lights were partially dimmed and she had been focused on the screen. The drive was gone. Brennan got the courthouse security footage request in within 6 minutes. The response came back in 4. The corridor camera outside courtroom 7 showed a man in a gray maintenance uniform entering the courtroom at 8:41 a.m., 12 minutes into the footage playback, and exiting 2 minutes later. The man's face was partially obscured by the brim of a work cap. Garrett looked at the still frame on Brennan's phone for approximately 2 seconds. "Reyes," he said. Not a question. Brennan said, "He was in the building. He was already in the building before the hearing started." She said it with the flat precision of someone cataloging a failure. The 3-block location was a decoy. He was already here. Marcus said, "So the call Damien made during the footage was telling Reyes to move," Garrett said. "Reyes was already positioned. He just needed the signal." The corridor was very quiet for a moment. Isabella thought about Damien sitting at the defense table with his hands folded while her voice described 4 years of what he had done in rooms he thought were private. She thought about his face while the footage ran. Still, composed, holding the posture. She thought about his hand under the table for 40 seconds. She thought, he came here to lose the hearing. She thought, he came here to watch what we had and take the one thing we were carrying and walk out. She said, he knew about the drive. Everyone looked at her. He knew what we pulled from the archive last night, she said. His people accessed the account at 11:53 and found it clean, but they were in the account. They could see the download logs, even if they didn't think they could, even if we routed it. Garrett, when we pulled the connection, did we pull it before or after the session authenticated? Garrett was quiet for 1 second. After, he said. So they saw an authenticated session. They would have seen a session open and close. If they were good enough, they could have captured the download manifest before the session closed. He said it carefully. I thought the timing. I told you to pull it, she said. That's on me. I made the call. She looked at Marcus. They knew what we downloaded. They knew the drive existed, and they knew Whitaker would carry it into the courtroom. Marcus said, how did they know about the document bag? She looked at him. He understood before she said it. He said, Hargrove. She said, Hargrove saw Whitaker arrive at the courthouse. Hargrove's notation in the security system. That wasn't a signal to other officers. It was cover. It was Hargrove telling Damien's people that the courthouse was accessible, that the security flag would slow any response if something happened inside. Brennan sat down on a bench in the corridor. She sat down like something had gone out of her legs. She said, 9 years. Nobody answered her. She looked at the floor. 9 years I worked in that building. I trusted... She stopped. I brought Hargrove coffee. I covered his shifts. When his daughter was sick, I covered his shifts for a week. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but the area around them was tight, in a way that meant the dryness was costing her something. I need to make a call, she said. She made the call. Mbem. Hargrove was detained at 9:47 a.m. Not by Brennan's call. Her call went over Hargrove's head to a commander who had been aware of internal affairs concerns about the division for 14 months and had been waiting, with the patience of a man who understood how these things worked, for something he could move on. Brennan's call gave him something to move on. The detention was quick, clinical, and happened in the parking structure of the division building 6 blocks away, where Hargrove had gone after the courthouse. He had a phone with him that had 3 calls to an unregistered number in the last 18 hours. Costa was picked up at the airport at 10:23 a.m., attempting to board a flight using a name that was not his name. Reyes was harder. Reyes was the kind of person who had survived a long time by being the kind of person who was hard. He didn't go back to the port address. He didn't use the phone he'd used the day before. He moved through the city the way water moves through a city, by finding the low places, the gaps, the routes that nobody had thought to watch because there was no reason to watch them
until there was. Garrett found him anyway, not through official channels, through the particular network of people and information and favors owed that Garrett had been cultivating for 22 years and that had no official name and no public existence, and which Marcus had never fully explained to Brennan because some explanations created more problems than the things they explained. Reyes was found in a storage facility near the rail yards at 1:14 p.m. He had the drive. He did not have it for long.
The criminal filing went in at 2:30 p.m. It was more complete than it would have been that morning because the 3 hours between the courthouse and the filing had been used by Brennan, by Whitaker, by the commander who was now actively engaged, by a federal contact that Marcus had called after getting explicit clearance from Brennan to make one call to one person who existed above the level at which Damien's influence operated. Philip Marsh gave a sworn statement from his hospital bed at 1:50 p.m. He had been waiting to give it for 4 years. This was apparent in the quality of his voice on the recording. Not hesitant, not reluctant, but exhausted in the way of someone who has been holding something heavy for too long and has finally been permitted to set it down. Claire gave her statement by secure video at 2:10 p.m. She was sitting in her kitchen in a city that was not the city she'd been born in a house that was smaller than the one she'd had before, with the name that was technically her middle name, and she spoke for 37 minutes without being asked to stop. And what she said accounted for 8 months of a life that Damien Voss had managed the same way he'd managed everything. Controlled, calculated, deliberate, a message about ownership delivered in the language of intimacy. The other 2 women gave statements by the end of the day. Damien's attorneys filed 3 motions to suppress between noon and 4 p.m. Calloway denied all 3. At 4:47 p.m., Damien Voss was taken into custody on charges that included aggravated assault, criminal intimidation, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge was added at 4:30 p.m. after the recovered drive confirmed that Reyes had acted on direct instruction from a call placed from inside courtroom 7 at 8:41 a.m. Isabella was not at the courthouse when it happened. She was at a medical clinic 12 blocks away, because at 3:20 p.m. the baby had stopped turning and started something more purposeful, and Dr. Wells, who had been reachable and had met them there within 20 minutes, had looked at the monitor readings and said, in her calm, unhurried voice, "We're not in crisis. But we're not waiting much longer, either." Marcus sat in the waiting room with his hands on his knees. He sat there the way he had sat in the hallway outside the examination room the day before, not moving, just present, as if stillness itself was something he could offer. Garrett sat beside him. They did not talk for a long time. Then Marcus said, "I managed her." Garrett said, "Yes. I did it because I know why you did it. It wasn't right." "No," Garrett said. "But it wasn't only wrong either." He looked at the waiting room wall, at a painting that was there because someone had decided waiting rooms needed paintings, a landscape of somewhere peaceful and generic. "You kept her alive for 14 months. You built the architecture. You put the right people in the right positions. That's not nothing, Marcus." "She built the architecture," Marcus said. "She found the camera. She secured the footage. She stayed in that house for 14 months and kept that man from knowing what she was doing." He was quiet for a moment. "I just answered the phone." Garrett said nothing. After a while, Marcus said, "She's like her mother." Garrett said, "I know. Her mother would have done the same thing, would have stayed until she had what she needed and then walked out and not looked back." He looked at his hands. "I managed her mother too." "I know that as well." Marcus sat with that. The waiting room was quiet. Luca Haley Moretti was born at 7:43 p.m. He weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. He had the particular quality of newborns that is less beautiful than it is overwhelming. Not pretty, not peaceful, just enormous in the way that new life is enormous, filling the room with the fact that everything else in the room has to rearrange itself around. He cried for 40 seconds and then stopped because Dr. Wells put him against Isabella's chest and he heard something he recognized. Isabella lay with him and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The room was very quiet after the 40 seconds. She looked down at him, at his face,
which was the face of someone who had arrived somewhere after a long journey and had not yet decided what to make of where they'd landed. She looked at his hands, which were closed in the small automatic fists of the newly born, holding nothing, holding air. She thought about the East Corridor, the red light, the storm. She thought about a leather belt and learning not to scream and counting breaths in the dark. She thought about 11 days and a gray SUV and her father's voice saying, "I'm already here." She said very quietly to the ceiling, to her son, to nobody and everybody, "We made it." The baby did not respond. He was breathing. That was enough. Marcus came in 10 minutes later. He stood at the door for a moment before he came fully into the room, and Isabella saw him do it, saw him take the room in from the doorway, the way he'd always taken rooms in before entering them, assessing, measuring. Then she saw him stop doing it. She saw the assessment leave his face and something older and simpler replace it, something that had no military application and no strategic value whatsoever. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed, and he looked at his grandson. He looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he reached out, very carefully, and put one large hand against the side of the baby's head. Just his palm, just resting there, the way you put your hand on something you want to be sure is real. Isabella watched her father's face. She had seen it configure itself for 31 years around the requirements of discipline and command, around the effort of holding things in the correct order, of not allowing the personal to contaminate the operational. She had grown up understanding that the structure was love, that the managing and the controlling and the discipline were, underneath, love expressed through the only language he had been given. She understood that now in a way she hadn't at 9 or 19 or 27. She was not going to tell him it was enough, but she was going to let him sit here. She said, "He needs a name." Marcus looked up. "I know what I've filed," she said. "Luca Hale Moretti, that's the legal name, but he needs something we call him." She looked at her son. "Something that's just his." Marcus looked at the baby. He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother called me Hale," he said, "when she wanted to get my attention, not Marcus. Hale, like she was reminding me what I was made of." He paused. "I never minded it." Isabella looked at her son. "Luca," she said. The baby's hand opened and closed around air. The trial lasted 11 days. Not because the evidence was complicated. The evidence was not complicated. The 47 hours of authenticated footage were not complicated. Philip Marsh's testimony was not complicated. Claire's testimony was not complicated. The medical documentation, the financial records, the phone log showing a call placed from courtroom 7 to an unregistered number at 8:41 a.m. None of it was complicated. What took 11 days was the particular process of watching a man who had spent 40 years constructing an image of himself discover that the image could not survive contact with what the image had done. Damien's attorneys were skilled and thorough and raised every contestable point that was contestable. The jury watched them do it. The jury also watched the footage. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Isabella was not in the courtroom for the verdict. She was at a rental house in a quiet neighborhood 30 miles from the city, in a house that had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that got morning light, and a small backyard where an oak tree grew along the fence line. She was sitting in the backyard when Whitaker called, with Luca in her arms. 6 weeks old now, still learning the world's basic geometry, tracking light and shadow and the movement of leaves in the particular intent way of the very new. Whitaker said, "It's done." She said, "All of it. All of it. The financial crimes, the assault charges, the conspiracy, the obstruction, all of it." He paused. "He's going to appeal." "I know." "The appeal will take— Oh, I know, Nathan." "He won't win it." "I know that too." She sat with the phone against her ear and looked at the oak tree and the morning light coming through it. Behind her, through the kitchen window, she could hear Marcus moving around. He had stayed, not because she'd asked him to stay exactly, but because she hadn't told him to leave, and because Luca seemed to find his presence settling in a way that neither of them had commented on, but both had noticed. She said, "Thank you." Whitaker said, "Isabella, thank you," she said again,
and this time she meant it in a way that went past the professional, past the case, past the 11 days and the parking structure and the courthouse corridor and the drive and all of it. She meant it the way you thank someone who was in the room when something very hard happened and didn't leave. He said quietly, "Take care of him." She looked at her son. "That's the plan," she said. She went back to the city once, 4 months later. Not to the house. The house had been sold, the proceeds frozen pending the financial investigation, and she had no reason to go there and did not. She went to a building downtown, a conference room on the 14th floor of a building that housed, among other things, an organization that worked with survivors of domestic abuse connected to high net worth families. The kind of families where abuse was better hidden, better funded, better protected from consequence. The woman who ran the organization was named Diaz. She had a direct, unornamented manner and an office filled with files and the organizational chaos of someone doing more work than their resources allowed. She said, "We don't usually get people with your particular experience." Isabella said, "What kind of experience is that?" Diaz said, "The kind that knows how it works from the inside. The lawyers, the security systems, the way information gets managed. Most of our clients know what happened to them, but they don't always know the architecture." She looked at Isabella. "You know the architecture." Isabella thought about 17 files. A secondary camera system, a small red light in the corner of a room nobody went to. "I know some of it," she said. She started working with Diaz's organization the following month. She was not a counselor. She was clear about that. She didn't have the training and she wasn't pretending to. What she did was practical. She sat with women who had the specific question she'd had. What is actually possible, given what I have, given where I am, given who he is? She sat with that question and answered it as honestly as she could, which meant sometimes the answer was hard, and sometimes the answer was not yet, and sometimes the answer was, here is what I did, here is what worked, here is what I wish I'd known. She did not tell every woman her story, but she told it when it helped. It helped more often than she'd expected. Marcus left in the 5th month. He had stayed longer than either of them had planned, which was neither of their styles and which they did not discuss directly. He'd been there for Luca's first smile, which turned out to be gas, but which they had both chosen to count anyway. And for the first time, Luca tracked a moving object across a room with his eyes with what looked like genuine concentration, and Marcus had looked at his grandson doing this with an expression that Isabella stored in the part of her memory that she kept for things she didn't want to lose. The morning he left, they stood in the kitchen with coffee. She said, "You'll come back." "Yes." "Not to manage things." He looked at her. The corners of his mouth moved. "No," he said, "not to manage things." She said, "Just to be here." "Yes." She nodded. He picked up his bag. At the door he stopped and he turned, and he looked at her. Just looked at her the way you look at something you want to hold in your mind clearly, without the management of it, without the strategy of it, just the fact of it. He said, "You're the bravest person I've ever known." She said, "You're biased." He said, "I've known a lot of people." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Drive safe, Hale." He laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised, the laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh in that moment. And she watched it cross his face and thought about her mother saying that name in that tone, and understood that it was the right sound to send him out the door with. He left. She stood in the kitchen with her coffee and listened to the car pull away, and then the neighborhood quiet settling back in. The ordinary morning sounds of a street where people went to work and came home and had no particular reason to notice what happened in the house with the oak tree in the backyard. See, Luca learned to walk on a Tuesday in late spring. He had been close for 2 weeks, cruising along the furniture, standing and sitting and standing again with the concentrated effort of someone working on a problem that required the full application of everything they had. Isabella had watched him work on it the way she'd watched everything he did, completely, with the particular quality of attention that is not anxious but is very present, that does not project forward into what might go wrong but stays exactly in the moment of what is happening. He stood up in the middle of the living room, away from the furniture, away from anything to hold, and he stood there for a moment in the uncertain equilibrium of the almost ready.
and then he took 3 steps and sat down hard on the floor. He looked up at her. She looked back. She said, "Again." He got up. He took 4 steps this time and then sat down again, and this time he laughed. The full-body laugh of a not quite 1-year-old. The laugh of someone who has discovered that falling is not the end of things, that you can fall and get up and go farther, and it is, in fact, funny. She laughed too. She laughed in the living room of a house that was hers, that had morning light in the kitchen, and an oak tree in the backyard, and no security cameras, and no measured footsteps in the hall. And her son laughed with her, and outside the window the spring light came through the leaves the way it came through every spring, unhurried, not particularly interested in what had happened in the rooms it touched, just present and generous and without memory of the winter. She looked at him. He looked at her. She thought, this is the thing that could not be taken. Not the footage, not the court record, not the verdict and the sentence and the financial reckoning that was still working its way through 3 years of hearings she no longer attended. Not the work with Diaz, not the testimony she would eventually give before lawmakers in a building that had marble floors and people who took notes. Not even the specific courage of 11 counted nights. This room, this child, the ordinary, unhurried Tuesday of it. She got up off the floor where she'd been sitting to be at his level, and she crossed to the window and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree was in full leaf now, the bare winter branches completely gone under the weight of it, and she stood and looked at it and let herself have 1 full minute of looking at it. Not measuring the room, not calculating exits, not listening for footsteps, just looking at a tree in a yard in the morning light of a Tuesday in spring. 1 minute. Then Luca, behind her, said something in the emphatic, consonant-forward language of the very young that was not quite a word but was clearly a demand. She turned. "Okay," she said. "Come on, then." She held out her hands. He got up.